pluralism isn't some sort of false neutrality or avoidance of conflict, right? Or this anything goes attitude.
Okay, I'm
But
gonna have a lot of people really upset at me if I don't ask about Zionism and anti-Zionism.
yeah.
Rabbi Ben Berger is the Senior Vice President for Education, Community, and Culture at Hillel International. Ben, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It is wonderful to be here. Can I call you Daniel or Rabbi
You
Levine?
can. You can call me Daniel. There
Okay.
is a crazy story that's lurking in the Talmud revolving Hillel and Shammai, who many people might know as the study partner who got along even though they disagreed. And that is the center of a fascinating article you wrote. It's the reason why that I wanted to talk to you about any and all these issues about pluralism, disagreement, and what happens when disagreement goes wrong. Can you just paint the picture of what happens in this story?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I want to note that this is a story that we both appreciate and admire, and that I only found out afterward, but that it's a story that you've written about as well, and that you wrote about in a time of like when you were under major duress and in a point of conflict when people were sort of coming after you for an unpopular opinion. So it's clearly a story that resonates, and I think it's one of the stories that is not really told about the relationship between Hillel and Shammai so often. So for this article that I wrote for the Sources Journal put out by the Hartman Institute, I started with this article as sort of setting up the premise of a larger conversation about polarization and pluralism. And I started with the article because it's a powerful illustration of the risks of when conflict goes too far, when it goes awry, and also the necessity of having conflict within the space of the Beit Midrash. So let me just take us into the article, into the source for a second. So it starts with the Mishnah and followed by a Gemara in Shabbat in the Talmud Bavli that says that on one particular day, Hillel and Shammai had 18 disagreements upon which the winner of those disagreements, or the halacha, went according to Shammai. Now, anyone who studied the Talmud a little bit, or at least listened to, any of the stories of their rabbis, or spent a moment around Hillel, you know that Hillel normally wins in almost all of the arguments of Hillel and Shammai. But on this particular day, it was Shammai who did, um, and it's on a whole list of relatively obscure issues related mostly to tuma and tahara, purity and impurity. I don't want to go so into those. They look obscure to us today, but I think maybe in the time that they were arguing, they were probably more important actually,
I
issues
don't
of
know. Our
tuma and
guests might
tahara.
appreciate 45 minutes on just the laws of purity and impurity for.
Right, exactly. So maybe that's for another time. But there comes a moment where Shammai has had enough with Hillel and decides to assert the authority that comes with being on the majority on that particular day in the Beit Midrash, and says, "Enough, enough. If you're going to push me so hard, I'm gonna shove a sword into the entrance of the Beit Midrash, at the entrance of the Beit Midrash, and declare that whoever's in is in and whoever's out is out." Which is to say that the conflict ends here. I'm clearly the majority, and we have an important principle in Torah, achrei rabim lahatot. After the majority goes the opinion or the spoils, if you will. And Shammai declares that on that day, these halachot, or on that day, the halachot went according to Shammai. Now, um, and Hillel, maybe a Hillel sort of way, bows down to Shammai and says, "Okay, the halacha is yours," and doesn't fight it any further. Now, interestingly, the Gemara goes on to say that that day was as if it was the day of the golden calf, right? One of the most horrific days in the history of the Jewish people, I would say, a moment of great chaos and idolatry. So we can get into why that is, why that's a day of such a terrible day, or at least that's how it's seen retrospectively in the Talmud, and I think seen retrospectively because that's what the students of Hillel, how they see it. And they ultimately are sort of the narrators of much of the Talmud from there on. But the sword at the entrance is an incredible symbol, and of the specter of violence that enters into a community when there is deep disagreement. Now, I don't take it, and I'll hand it back to you, but I don't take it that that's necessarily always a bad thing. What for me it says is that it's a recognition of conflict, of deep disagreement, but sort of laying it out, this is how it is, but there has to be rules and there has to be a way that we follow those rules. And we see that in other contexts, actually in the story of Hillel and Shammai elsewhere. But the buck stops here, essentially, is what Shammai is saying, that, and the sword is a symbol of that. Now, the risk is what happens when the sword gets unsheathed, as it were. And I want to talk about that as well, because we know there's another text that is actually from the Yerushalmi Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, or the Palestinian Talmud, where it's no longer just the specter of violence that we see, but it's actually violence, right? And the we see a terrible result of that on that day. Shammai's students were slaughtering the students of Hillel and preventing those students, students of Hillel, from going into the Beit Midrash to be able to vote against Shammai and take back the majority.
There's a famous article about Yavneh. I'm going to completely forget who the professor was who wrote this, but it sort of very much frames the rabbinic project, because I think, oftentimes I think our job as rabbis is to see parallels between Jewish history, Jewish texts, and the values that inform how we view our lives now. And just for listeners' background who might not be up to date on the Second Temple socio-political situation, the Jewish world was in quite disarray. I always joke that if you think that the divisions in our world and Jewish community today are bad, just read Josephus. And Josephus describes
Yeah.
all these variety of sectarian groups that had not just different philosophies and theologies, but completely different political goals. What do you do with the Romans? Do you need Israel? Do you not need Israel? Do you just run away to the desert? Do you sort of adopt a new religion, such as Christianity? And the rabbis very much in their best attempted to say, well, we can actually contain a multiplicity of opinions within actually one institution, right? That was sort of the idea of Yavneh. Now, what you're talking about, right? Hillel and Shammai were two of those early architects, right? Part of the early pairs of Zugim, as we know in Jewish tradition. As you pointed out in the story in the Jerusalem Talmud, actual violence breaks out. And the Talmud in general is simultaneously, I think, a great case study text in how to have a community centered around disagreement, with also some really crazy stories about violence and social upheaval being done because of disagreement. Just while you were talking, I remembered of one of my other favorite Talmudic stories, which is Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yohanan, who were a great Babylonian study pair. And just, I'll give the 10-second background for listeners. Reish Lakish used to be some sort of bandit or gangster before he became a rabbi. And he was one day in a debate also around the laws of purity and impurity with his study partner, Rabbi Yohanan. And they were debating when a sword is considered a complete entity. And Reish Lakish had one opinion, Rabbi Yochanan had another. And rather than, civil dialogue of here's why I disagree, Yochanan insults him and said, well, you would know, you're a bandit, right? A bandit knows his craft. And the Talmud in classic, Talmudic hyperbole says Reish Lakish was so distressed that he died. And then later on, Rabbi Yochanan ends up dying, right? And, death is probably somewhat metaphorical here for, death of community and death of conversation. But there's story upon story. Now, what I take from that story, because at the end of the story, and this is one of my favorite lines really in Jewish tradition, and I don't think I've ever spoken about this on the podcast before, so thank you for giving me the opportunity,
So
is
glad to be able to.
after Reish Lakish dies, Yochanan is in distress because his study partner has gone away. And so his friends decide, okay, we got to find you a new substitute study partner. And so, you can imagine they search, the community, and they find this really smart guy. And they're like, all right, this guy, encyclopedic knowledge, he knows everything. He'll be a great study partner. But because this guy was so smart and wise, every time Yochanan had an idea, his new study partner said, you're right. Here are 4 other reasons you didn't even think of why you're right. And Yochanan, instead of welcoming that, maybe it was great for 2 days, but after a week or a month or a year of your interlocutor constantly saying, you're right, you're right, you're right, right, that sounds awful. And that's when Yochanan ended up sort of having this, climactic end of story where he says, I know I'm right. I need somebody to challenge me. I miss Reish Lakish. And so the rabbis are simultaneously, right? They're not being naive about it. And what I love about the story in the Jerusalem Talmud, and I always, sneak it in whenever I teach about Hillel and Shammai, because most of the texts of Hillel and Shammai, just if listeners are not familiar, it's, these and these are the words of the living God. And, yes, they still were able to marry each other's sons and daughters. And Hillel taught Shammai's views first, right? It's sort of like very utopian nice. And I can imagine most students listen to this and they say, okay, but when I turn on the news and when I'm debating, if you're on the right, debating with someone who's on the left or a Zionist and anti-Zionist, it's not like that. And the rabbis are saying, you're right. There actually is the specter of violence, but this is the best option we have. There is no alternative. And so I absolutely love that you brought this text.
Yeah, I'm not, I would just say like I'm not sure that there's no alternative. I think of these texts actually often like the famous Chekhov's principle, right? When the gun is introduced into the scene in Act One, it will always be used in Act Three, right? And I think that that's the risk when we see the sword jammed into the entrance of the Beit Midrash. There's a real likelihood that it's going to be used, and I think that the Yerushalmi understands that principle well. I think the job of a great leader, and especially a leader in a pluralistic space, is actually to prevent Act Three from coming, right? Act Three from playing out as Chekhov would anticipate. The job is of the leader is to make sure that the sword stays sheathed or stays stuck in the ground. And that what I mean by that is ultimately um, when we're creating pluralistic spaces, which Hillel, which we both have the honor and opportunity to do most of our work in, um, is a deeply sort of ingrained in its DNA a pluralistic space, or at least ideal in its ideal it is. Not always in practice that we know to be true. Um, but what we often misunderstand about what pluralism is, I think, in these spaces is that it's like a type of like, anything goes, or, I'm okay, you're okay, we're all okay. What I'm trying to argue in this article actually is that pluralism isn't some sort of false neutrality or avoidance of conflict, right? Or this anything goes attitude. But rather, it's, I would say, a disciplined practice of engagement around hard ideas. And it's the raising up of conflict and the pushing toward not avoiding conflict, but engaging conflict in ways that are ultimately healthy, ways that are opening, that create more opportunity for building healthy, diverse communities rather than less. And the risk, and the risk of our time, and this is what I'm really trying to get to when I speak about pluralism, the greatest risk of our time, I think, and it's in broadly in American society at least, and I think far beyond that, but certainly within American Jewish communities, and we could speak about Israel as well, but the situation is different there. The risk is that the sort of the sacred covenant of our people that can exist within our communities, within our buildings, within our institutions, is being broken down because the sword is no longer being taken seriously, and we don't have enough leaders, or we don't have enough wherewithal to say let's have the debate here, let's have the disagreement, it's okay, but let's leave the sword sheathed. And that's where this starts.
Yeah, when I was saying that there's no other option, I was more referring to the idea that the rabbis understood, you either try with dialogue and maybe violence, can break out, or you
Sure.
just start with violence, meaning, I think we're learning that in liberal democracy either. I mean, it kind of, on the one hand, many Americans probably feel like it sucks to have people that are diametrically opposed from them politically and they have to, work with them and deal with them. On the other hand, what is the alternative? Just endless war between, two factions of our country for all of eternity. And so I think that that's what the rabbis were really trying to get at, especially because, I mean, we've even, codified this in Jewish tradition. Everyone knows, why was the second temple destroyed? Okay, we say, sinah chinam, basic hatred, baseless hatred, but really it was because, all these sectarian groups. I mean, the rabbis are sort of getting at that in their own way of saying, if you just have a bunch of groups and they all just start hating each other and they stop working together towards a common goal, that thing just crumbles. I mean, the funny thing that I always say about the rabbi's depiction of the destruction of the temple is that the Romans are almost like, an extra background character.
Right.
They never, I mean, it's so funny because, why was the second temple destroyed? It's like, have you ever studied the history of Rome? They were just a very strong army. And the rabbis, of
Right.
course, don't go there. I wanted to, get us a little bit to, the contemporary world and, speak a little bit, maybe not practically because, like I say, every time talking about pluralism, we're not going to get to any concrete answers, but I think we could at least bound our conversation in ways that might make sense to people. Pluralism, you sort of alluded to this before, it sort of gets a bad rap because people seem to stereotype pluralism as, anything goes, whatever, we don't have any real values. What I hear you saying is that pluralism is more of an action than an ideology. And I would love for you to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah. Absolutely. So first of all, pluralism, I think, is sort of a uniquely American construct, actually, even though I think we can see its roots much deeper and clearly we can identify it within the Jewish tradition, as we've just done. And I think that one of the powerful things about America's sort of unique version of liberal democracy is that um, it can hold a lot. It's highly capacious, and right now we're in a place where that's really challenged, right? Where the capaciousness is almost causing um, us to turn against each other and constrict us, and we're losing sort of the thread on what liberal democracy is. So I would just want to say that because I do think that there's something about Hillel being created in the context of America, and especially when it was created in 1923 in the post World War I era. I think and the hundred plus years of Hillel really speak to sort of, as I said, its DNA of being deeply pluralistic. I also, and then we see how that plays out on a college campus. And I think that there's like a very practical matter of pluralism that I think is worth bringing up before we get into sort of the theory of it a little bit more, which is that when we are in the context of college campus and our students in particular are in the college campus where they are for the in setting for most of them the first time in their lives where they're um, in non-homogeneous community, right? They're encountering all sorts of different people, all sorts of types of diversity, both both Jewish diversity and much more broadly speaking. And so from that perspective, pluralism is sort of just a matter of fact. Like you're in it, right? And with all these people, and you got to figure out how to live, right? You can try and avoid it, and you can cut yourself off, I think, from a lot of the benefits of what college is about by where you go or how you exist within campus. But for the most part, that's not the case for an enormous percentage of our people. But then I want to take it to how I really understand pluralism, which, you mentioned the famous text of Elu ve'elu, divrei Elokim chayim, that of Hillel and Shammai. These and these are the words of the living God, which is the mantra of, many Jewish pluralists. And I find it to be moving as well and believe in its, beauty as an aspirational text. But I think it's very disingenuous to quote Elu ve'elu, these and these are the words of the living God, without the second half, right? Which is the halacha kebeit Hillel, right? The law was according to Beit Hillel, because you got to choose. Our spaces can't be anything for anyone, as I said before. But then, it goes further, and I think here's the clue to how actually we can really understand pluralism, which is, why is the halacha kebeit Hillel? According to Beit Hillel, it's not because his arguments were necessarily stronger, actually, right? It's because we see that he was forbearing and he was humble, and he would speak about the halachot of Shammai before his own, actually, right? And taught his students that way. And so we see that break down, obviously, with the text that we started with. But I think that latter part of this, the Elu ve'elu story, points the way not toward an ideological type of pluralism, which is what most of us think, or theological pluralism, which is what that text would make you think, but actually to a behavioral pluralism. That really pluralism is not about what we believe, but how we treat each other and how we behave toward each other. And I think that that's the key to maintaining pluralistic communities, and that's I think what the sword at the entrance is trying to teach us, that really what we have to do is think about how we treat each other. So you know, I'm willing to let a lot of voices into my spaces, right? Whether it's Hillel when I worked on campus or otherwise. And I think we have to trust students to be able to hear a lot of things, a lot of hard opinions. And I think um and that's not to say that we platform every opinion and that every opinion is, correct. We learn that there are 70 faces to the Torah. There were 70, but not 71, perhaps, right? It's not infinite. And so we do have to cut it off. There are voices I would not want to platform. But I think we have to think very capaciously also, widely about whose voices we bring in. But the cutoff has to be in how people behave. If you treat me or treat my students with contempt, with meanness, with cruelty, you're out. You're out. Even though I might love you and want you to be a good Jew and want you to put on tefillin and light Shabbos candles. If you treat us cruelly, if you're not kind, no matter what your position is, even if your position is actually the same as mine, about Israel or about whatever the issue is, you're out. Behavior
Yeah, I
is
think what you're getting at, I mean, it's an interesting thought of, I think one of the meta questions of pluralism, because there's a bunch of meta questions that I want to get to some challenges, I
good.
think, that people have with pluralism. One of the meta questions is, does pluralism mean you need to be pluralistic towards non-pluralists? Or another way to say that is,
Yeah.
does liberalism mean you need to invite illiberalism? I won't make you comment on this, but, right after the Mahmoud Khalil situation, I had a debate with a friend of mine who's a lawyer, and I debated, sort of the liberal case for kicking him out of the country. And my argument essentially was like, listen, you can't be liberal so much to invite in so much illiberalism that essentially liberalism goes away. And so I'm curious, because one other story, I mean, this I guess turned into a nice Chavruta Talmud session, but
Yeah.
sort of, if we're talking about sort of the big three, if you have any source sheet on dialogue and conversation, we've already hit Reish Lakish, we've already hit Hillel and Shammai, so someone needs to bring up the Oven of Aknai story, which is sort of a classic. And, this is also a case dealing with purity and impurity. So I guess the rabbis were, very, obviously this was a topic that meant a lot to them. And this is a case where Eliezer is in the minority opinion of his ruling, and he is now performing all of these miracles, and these miracles are going his way. So clearly, the river's flowing backwards, the trees are uprooted from the ground, the walls of the Beit Midrash are closing in, and the other rabbis weren't listening to him. And so Eliezer finally says, if I'm right, God should come and essentially say that I'm right, right? My opinion is correct. So God, eventually, of course, says, Eliezer is correct. And the rabbis, brush away God, quoting a verse back from the Torah, the Torah is not in heaven. Now, that story has an ending that most people don't pay attention to, which is Eliezer actually ends up getting excommunicated by the community. It's not that Eliezer, the next day they're like, oh, that was crazy. Like, okay, I guess we're not even listening to a divine voice here. I guess this is all, sort of a democracy here. But Eliezer actually gets kicked out and spends the rest of his life in some sort of, excommunicative isolation. There's probably a lot to say about that there, but it seems that the rabbis also did have very red lines for when somebody is disrupting the pluralistic norm that they were trying to bring. Meaning it's okay if you consider, this glass of water pure or impure, right? The rabbis are saying as long as you have good arguments, elu ve'elu, right? Divrei Elokim Chaim, if you're in good faith and I'm in good faith, that's cool. But if the community decides that they're going to accept, my view, if we decide that, this institution stands for X, Y, and Z, and then at that point you still continue to say, no, 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 no one's allowed to drink it, it's not kosher. The rabbis actually did seem like they were fans of saying, okay, we have to, for the sake of the wider community, actually sometimes push people out of the community. I'm curious how you think that idea reverberates, in the sort of contemporary practice of pluralism, liberalism, all those things.
Oh, it's a great question. I'm going to quote another text, but not from the Talmud actually. So this is the issue of sources that my article is in, and I want to recommend really not just my article, but the whole issue. There's some really great pieces, and one of the pieces that I was really moved by, which I would recommend you interview actually, Professor Daniel Schwartz, who is a professor here at GW, also a member of my synagogue, so maybe I'm a little biased, but really a brilliant guy and a great historian. And he writes about the case of Baruch Spinoza and his famous excommunication, speaking of excommunications, and revisiting the excommunication now. And with what I expected to go in to the article was that he would make a vigorous case against excommunication, against against the way that he was treated, and argue to bring him back, which is there's been a pretty significant movement for that. To welcome Spinoza back into the fold, even hundreds of years after his death and after his excommunication. And he actually goes the other way, and I can't do the article justice here, but and it's sort of maybe a shallow retelling of one part of it. One of the things that he says is that it's possible that the community that was most behind the excommunication was actually the community that he came from, which was a community of conversos, people who had come back from Spain and Portugal, who had been living Catholic lives and then came back to Amsterdam and were able to once live Jewishly, and they had to fight very hard for this. This was not a simple story for them, and again, I'm not doing the full story justice, but what Spinoza did in his declarations around around theology, around belief in God and such, was actually not so offensive in the ideas themselves and the theological ideas themselves, but actually in the ways that they were undermining the unbelievably difficult and courageous decision that his fellow community members, right, his parents, I believe, were conversos, and that his fellow community members had to go through in order to reclaim their Jewish identity, in order to come back into the community, after having been taken away for hundreds of years, right? And secretly keeping, some of the practices of Judaism, so only, so that it would lie dormant, so that they could bring it back, upon their arrival in Amsterdam. And what he did basically was say, no, on all of the journey that you've been through, all of the stuff, none of that matters. Those beliefs don't matter, right? They are ultimately foolish, right? And because we know this and this and this, and so again, what I point that out to, and this is where it gets complicated, is when a person's arguments are so undermining of another person's identity, right? And they're meant to strip another person of their dignity, right? And the things that they are fighting for to live, because they're ultimately, about vanquishing the other, right? They're not about bringing more truth into the world and lifting a community through embracing diversity, but they're actually about vanquishing and destroying the other. That's where I think we have to hold, again, strict lines, because the line, the line from ideas to sort of behavior, as I mentioned before, I think is very thin there. When your only goal is to like destroy your enemy or the people who you identify as your enemy. And sometimes what we're seeing in our communities is that we identify the enemy in people who we actually should and could and have felt very close to, and they've once been our allies. And that's what happens, especially in periods like this when we're under such duress as a people.
Yeah, I love the Spinoza case. I'm gonna have to read that article. There was an article I think that Tikva ran a couple of years ago, somewhat provocative. It's called "Is Spinoza the Architect of Modern Anti-Semitism?" And they talk about that a lot. And that I think they make I'm forgetting the writer, but he makes the same point, which is it wasn't just about philosophy, because some of the more you know extreme or liberal readings of Maimonides, he's not super different than Spinoza, but what was different was that separating himself from the community and looking back at the community and sort of dragging them through the mud. There's sort of a lot to say there. The other point, I think it sort of connects, another meta question, or maybe even a challenge of pluralism. I got to spend all of Shabbat asking, friends of mine, when you hear pluralism, what are sort of the, big challenges that ring out for you? So these aren't even my
Sounds like a
questions. You have a
fun
whole
Shabbat.
community here firing questions at you.
Right.
We'll start practical, then we'll go to ideological. There's a view of, and I think this is equally true for liberalism, and it speaks to the current moment, that this is just not a sustainable worldview because it's not packaging something concrete. In other words, the premise of this would be humans are hardwired for specific identity, right? We can quote, psychological experiments ad nauseum. They have the famous experiment. They just take 30 kids, divide them into two groups, and call one team the blue team and one team the red team. We do this at Jewish camps everywhere. And by the end of the week, these two groups have all the tribal identity monikers of, they're more willing to give their own team the benefit of the doubt and more likely to harbor stereotypes against the other team. And, in color war, it's playful, but if that continued for a month, if color war lasted a month, it might start to devolve into something a little bit less, fun and campy. And so this idea would be people are going to latch on to strong identities, and liberalism slash pluralism slash, you haven't used the term postmodernism, but oftentimes people lump it in. If you don't agree with this lumping in, let me know. Just provides for sort of a menu of options, but at the end of the day, people want to be with a group. And so if the dominant, American zeitgeist is pluralism, or the dominant, Jewish on campus zeitgeist is, pluralism, then they're just going to find their strong identity somewhere else, be it in a political group, on the right or the left, or another Jewish group that has a much more particular notion of Judaism. So even if, this argument would go, pluralism is a virtue, and like, halavai, if only the whole world can be Hillel and Shammai and 70 faces of Torah and these are the words of living God. For us as educators dealing with people, or getting to work with people 18 to 25 who are in this time of their life where they're trying to find concrete identity, if we provide them with not a concrete, strict identity, but with sort of a smorgasbord of options, that's actually somewhat of a disservice, and they'll probably find identity elsewhere. Wanted to throw that too.
Yeah, maybe I'll start personal here. I grew up in Los Angeles. I grew up a Reform Jew, proudly Jewish, but not deeply Jewish, I would say, and went to UC Santa Cruz and go banana slugs. And when I was there, I avoided Jewish life really for the first year and a half, maybe 2 years, and then sort of with a sort of out of a deep desire to like understand the world a little bit better, I decided I was going to go to Israel for my junior year. And when I returned to Santa Cruz, I the Second Intifada started, and I became very engaged in pro-Israel advocacy. And it was in that moment that I started also to become observant. And eventually would become Orthodox, and eventually get Orthodox smicha, and that's a whole long story that we don't need to go into now. But it was actually in the sort of the space of a pluralistic campus, right, and a highly liberal and even radical, campus in some ways, that I was able to find my way to tradition. In fact, I say it was my greatest form of rebellion was to become an Orthodox Jew in a place where there were no rules.
And is that
And
is that because, I mean, I'm just wondering, is this because of pluralism, or was this in spite of it? Meaning,
yeah,
is this an
it,
example of you not finding identity within the, general liberalism of campus and saying, I want this concrete thing, or you think pluralism was sort of a stepping stone to, you were given a taste of options and you found one that spoke to you and you're like, okay, this is great.
Yeah, so I'd like to think it's the latter. I like to think it was actually because of the pluralism that I found when I went to Hillel and when I went to Chabad. I became very involved with both, as both in some way as an escape from the intensity of the pro-Israel advocacy that I was involved with. The two rabbis who I became very close to in those spaces were very different, right? As you can imagine, had very different commitments to Jewish life, to halakha. Well, I wouldn't say different commitments to Jewish life. They had different commitments to halakha and to theology, certainly, but they were both deeply committed to Jewish life. And they represented two very different perspectives and ways of living. And the truth is, I didn't want what either of them were offering, right? And so but the fact that they were offering, and the fact that I could see in them, in each of them, and something that I could strive for, attain, borrow from, learn from, and I just started picking up books off their bookshelves, honestly, and that's what sort of drew me. And even in the library that I encountered in those moments, I experienced a sort of deep pluralism, right? Because it pushed me to engage with ideas from very different places and very different people, and also the activism that I was involved with also pushed me to think differently about my own positions, to not only engage with the sort of convictions that I had, but also eventually, and this didn't come easily, and I would say probably not in that year, but eventually to balance my convictions with humility, which is something I think we should all be doing, right? Especially the most activists amongst us, is to find ways to balance conviction with humility. That's a little bit of an aside, but but what I would say is that the opportunity to engage with different types of Jews and different types of Judaism in a very open environment, a very liberal, open environment, actually was the pluralism that I needed. It actually gave me the constraints I needed to find my own path forward. And I think that that's what, when pluralism looks great on a campus and is working great in the context of a Jewish community, and I don't mean just within the context of Hillel, but I think within the entire ecosystem, then I actually think that it can serve as a powerful model, a sacred model even, for finding a life of meaning within Jewish seriousness, and thick community, and and ultimately, for me, again, I started with myself. I would say that's the path that I've tried to both, trod personally, but also as an educator, and help students to understand that, that's the life they can live. It doesn't have to look like mine, but it can and it should be one that takes this tradition they've been offered really seriously, because it's pretty amazing. First of all, it's pretty awesome. And it asks a lot of us, not just like an occasional sort of pop in sort of thing. It asks a lot of us, and but that lot of us can look very different. Uh,
It's funny because I'm in some way, my sort of origin story is maybe, not the exact opposite, but, I grew up in a very Orthodox community, spent years in yeshiva, really only had relationships with, the Orthodox community when I was an undergrad, at least till a point where I, for reasons beyond this podcast, I've spoken about it elsewhere, sort of left the Orthodox community, went to the world of sort of like liberal Judaism, pluralism, really threw myself in as a Hillel leader, both at the end of undergrad and grad school. I've obviously worked for Hillel for 8 years. And it's just funny that we're coming from opposite areas. And I think I've become not more skeptical, but I think I've started to see a lot of the sort of flaws in pluralism, even though, that's still how I identify. Like I don't identify as an Orthodox Jew, and in my own practice and my own beliefs, I'm totally pluralistic about it. One sort of case study of a situation that happens a lot, and I think the first couple times this happened, this was a very quick learning experience. I won't even go very controversial here. Thankfully, I've been, asked to officiate a lot of weddings over the last couple of years. It's one of the cool parts about hanging around this job for a long time is your students, eventually graduate and grow up and then become, real people and get married. And
and
so
also, I just want to say, and you're really good at it, right? And you touch people's lives, you connect deeply to them, and you help them understand who they can be, right? So they claim you as their own, which is just an incredible thing, and a great feather in your cap. Anyway, I interrupted, but I
I
just
appreciate
wanted
it.
to compliment
I'm
you.
just gonna cut that and put it on a loop. That'll be the whole podcast. No, so the first couple of times, and I'm actually curious to run this by you because this has been a topic that I think about a lot in terms of an educational approach, and I think I've shifted my educational approach because of this. The first couple of times I tried to do my, my educator thing. And so I said, okay, we'll meet for the first time. Here are, 6 or 7 different options of what a general chuppah can look like, ranging from very traditional Orthodox to Sephardic traditions to conservative, reform, renewal. Here's a bunch of different ketubah templates you can have. And I saw early on, and these are, predominantly non, Orthodox or traditional people, they had never really thought, many of these students, not all of them, that there was more than one right way to do a Jewish wedding. They just thought, yeah, there's Jewish weddings. You do the Jewish
Right.
wedding. And me giving them, here's this option, and then there's, and I wasn't doing this, super academically and nerdy, but I was saying, listen, the traditional ketubah preserves X, Y, and Z ideas that have been really important because of, the difference between civic and religious Jewish law. Now it's less important. So other movements have added this thing and this thing. And I just, some small percentage of them loved it and loved the journey. And others
Right.
at some point were just like, this is crazy. What did you do at your wedding? And I said, I did the traditional Orthodox thing. Okay, we'll have that. And I realized, and this is something that I think a lot of social psychologists also point out. It's the reason why when you go to Trader Joe's, there's one brand of you know tomato sauce, not 50. Is that people have choice paralysis.
Yeah.
And I often try to weigh as an educator if somebody asks me, all right, let's just pick a question that, we probably both get asked a lot. What is the Jewish view of heaven and hell, of the afterlife? You cannot you lose your Jewish educator credential if you give them a specific answer, right? Like, if your answer doesn't start with some example of there's many opinions, it's complicated, we've been debating about this for thousands of years, here's, three general types of ways Jewish thinkers tackle this. On the other hand, if a Jewish student is coming up to us and, asking very seriously, oh, I was talking with my Christian roommate about, the idea of heaven and hell in Christian tradition, and, this may be the first conversation they've ever had with a rabbi. What does Judaism think about this? And I default to well, there's Maimonides, and then there's a Zohar, and then there's this school of thought, and then, you know, and even if I try to do that a little bit, less, with quoting all these people and just say, well, there's a couple different opinions, that can actually be a turnoff for some people who, again, don't want the choices. And I've been struggling with this because inherently, like, I am a pluralist on both this question, how do you have a Jewish wedding? I'm a pluralist on, but when it comes to the actual practical of doing it, I found that to be difficult. So I'm giving you all of my pedagogical problems here in hopes that
Yeah, yeah. Well, I was, as you were describing what you were, your approach, I was thinking, oh, choice paralysis is a real problem here. And, in that moment, I think that there is an opportunity to go pastoral, at least to start, and ask the question of, well, what is it what you want, from your wedding? What is the most important thing for you at this wedding, right? And in your lives together, in your marriage together. And I think that we, as educators often, you know, jump to like the Torah that we've been trained to teach and to hold and to hold it with reverence, right? And say like and especially because I think as sort of simpatico here with like we see the breadth of this tradition and we're inspired by it from the most Ashkenazi positions to the most Sephardi and the most Orthodox and the most liberal and everything in between. Like I think we're both motivated by that diversity of ideas and opinions and practices. I think that so we go to those places and say, there's a whole table laid out for you and so many options for you. I think the place to start sometimes is just very simple, and with the who are you, like, and what matters to you, and what will be meaningful to you. And that's not to say that like halakha is important and the tradition is important, isn't important. I'm actually like a little bit more traditional in my approach to weddings and my approach to a lot of halach things, I would say at this point. In that, like, I wouldn't offer all of the things. I offer what is, what I feel like I can hold halachically, and feel accountable to my understandings of halacha and also to the way I was taught by my rebbeim. That still feels important to me to a certain extent, and so I wouldn't offer the range, but I would still, within what I am able to offer, feel very strongly about making the wedding in this example exactly what the couple needs, right? So that it can reach their hearts and their families' hearts and start them off on a journey together. And that I think is the key move. And I would say like just to expand that a little bit, that's what I understand actually as the role of the educator, and especially in the context of a place like Hillel. We are, a student-centric organization, right? We believe in the journeys of our students. We understand students as entering into college, as like adolescent Jews and leaving college as adult Jews. And in that liminal space between, we have an amazing opportunity to support them toward that in that process of growth. And so I don't apologize for saying like we're a student-centric organization. They're at the center of what we do, the programming we do, the decisions we do, the relationships we create. And we have to really listen deeply to them. And we have to listen to what their needs are and where they're coming from and what their hopes are and their aspirations and what's stressing them out and what's worrying them and, and all of the stuff, including the stuff about Israel that they're, feeling that's complicated or that's cheerful or whatever it is, all of the stuff. And we have to work with them so that they can understand that their tradition, the story of their people has something serious to say to them about the lives that they're living and will live, and that we can help guide them along the way. And so that's, it's a little bit of an opposite or different approach think
No, no, no. I like it.
I
I mean,
think
I
we're
think
trying to
what you're
get to the same place
highlighting.
ultimately.
No, no, no. I mean, I think funny enough, I think what you're highlighting in my mind constitutes a challenge to pluralism, and maybe it's just a different model of pluralism. And I have an interesting follow up to this, but what you seem to be saying, and what I'm hearing from you is the natural constraints that Jewish tradition or halacha imposes on you actually allows you to then foster within bounds a conversation of what that person, is interested in. It would be a lot more difficult if me and you, were trying to write a ketubah from scratch. I'm sure it would be an interesting project, but that would sort of be a disaster, right? And if every couple that you married, you were writing a ketubah from scratch, that would be kind of ridiculous. When I was
Right.
talking to Adam Lehman a couple weeks ago, this was actually a really interesting topic of conversation around a lot of Hillel rabbis, some which very much disagreed with this point I made, some agreed, so it was good fodder for conversation. I sort of said that my defaulted approach, now, because I don't think I told him the wedding thing, but I was thinking it in my mind, is now I've almost defaulted to the other side, where now somebody asks me a question, you know, I want to get married. What's a Jewish wedding? I give them the very concrete, traditional. Again, I grew up modern Orthodox, so like Ashkenazi, whatever. Here is what a Jewish wedding is like. Let's go through it. Let's talk. Then I ask them, the what's important to you, and then I let them into an open secret. We don't actually have to do almost any of this. Like, you don't want this, you want to add this. You guys want to speak under the chuppah. Whatever you want to do, but I start with the robust tradition, right? So as opposed to saying, here's a blank canvas, go paint your Jewish journey, which oftentimes I feel like as pluralistic institutions, we sometimes do. I don't want to stereotype and say we always do that, but we say, Shabbat is, a day of rest. What do you think rest is? We say, no, no, no. Shabbat is a day that is highly proscribed as to a bunch of things you can't do and a bunch of things you're supposed to do. That's Shabbat, right? Now, okay, let's engage with that. Okay, you really want to, your passion is writing, doing creative writing. Okay, so within a pluralistic mindset, I'm willing to say, okay, that could be somewhat of a, Shabbat practice. Certainly, no Orthodox person would condone that. But, I can say under the pluralistic, if you have a specific, writing journal that's your Shabbat writing journal, even though, no Jew before 1850 would have ever said that's a good idea, I can say, okay, fine. But I'm still starting off with the constraint of like, here are the general rules. Here's what you're not supposed to do, so that it's not the blank canvas. It's, very specific, but it's sort of this, cliche idea that, you need to know all the rules before you break them, which oftentimes I feel like the sort of default liberal or pluralistic thing to do is to kind of say like, hi, welcome. I'm Daniel. Nice to meet you. What is meaningful about you? How can I support your Jewish experience? As opposed to, and I think like working in the background, not the background, because I think Chabad brings a very helpful challenge to Hillel in this regard. Chabad, before asking your name, they're tying tefillin on you, and they're already
Yeah.
doing this like very concrete thing. And then, okay, what's meaningful to you? How can we help? What do you want to get
Yeah.
engaged in? But
Yeah.
like, they have the action centric. Here is the thing you are supposed to do. Here is, if you light Shabbos candles, you light tefillin. You are doing this positive, concrete thing, no matter what. And sometimes I feel like, okay, how can we do that more in a pluralistic framework where we have the, here is the very specific thing you should do. Then we'll sort of work it into a wider pluralism.
Yeah. So thinking back to some of the times where I've been asked to do weddings, or I've been in situations with students who are former students who have a halacha question for me, or need help with whether it's a conversion or wedding or whatever it is. There have been moments where I've had to say, I'm so happy for you and I want this life for you and all of that, and I'm not the rabbi to marry you. Um, and I bless you with such a great and happy and joyful life. But I think you need this rabbi, or who can help you get the wedding, the marriage you're looking for. And I don't think that. And by the way, that's not just on the left, that's also on the right. I've sent students to the kollel because I feel like the kollel can better serve a particular student, or Chabad. I've done that many times, and I've sent students to my more liberal colleagues, who I think can, marry them or convert them with with in the ways that those students are looking for. Part of my pluralism requires me to both see the beauty and value in what other people are doing and lead lives they're leading, but also, have integrity for my own positioning and my own sort of tr most, truly held beliefs, or um, and so I have to sometimes be willing to do that. And I'll admit there have been times where it's I think prematurely limited relationships or ended relationships that I wish could have gone on, and I could have continued to support them as an educator. And also times where it led to, like, perfect handoff. And I have a lot of other priorities, a lot of other students that I was able to move on to next as a result of being able to hand on. And I think we, as educators need to know, and rabbis need to know, like, when we can hold um, the diversity and the diverse opinions and needs in front of us, and when it's just too much. And thankfully, and this is one of the things that I love about living in our period of modernity, is that there's just and especially in the American version of it, that there's just so many options, and that there are a vast array of ways of accessing our tradition, that I believe, and this I truly believe, are full of beauty and full of passion, and full of seriousness. There are serious ways to access Judaism that are not my own. And I like, that's the key to my understanding of pluralism, to come back to, where we started.
Okay, I'm gonna have a lot of people really upset at me if I don't ask about Zionism and anti-Zionism,
Yeah,
because I think that is sort of the elephant in the room. Not even the elephant. I mean, I think we deal with this every single day. I was just at a Hillel conference a couple weeks ago. That was sort of all we talked about for
right.
2 or 3 days with a group of rabbis, is how to balance this out. One thing that I often say, and I'll run a strong opinion by you, and you can see if you take the bait or not, is there are very obvious ways in which we are not willing to be pluralistic. In other words, our pluralism is bounded. I think, we talked about the rabbis before. The obvious example is, if somebody is a Jew for Jesus, I still would want that student coming to Shabbat, but I would never hand them the microphone or let them invite a speaker or run an event themselves. I sort of feel the same way. I mean, even to pick a less extreme, less controversial example before going to anti-Zionism, I feel the same way if somebody tells me that they're never going to stop eating In-N-Out, right? Cheeseburgers. Great, still come to Shabbat. I still would, even if you're on the Hillel board, that's amazing. We're not going to serve that at Hillel events, and we're not going to do a class saying, here is a Jewish way to eat a cheeseburger. Maybe some people would. It's just not something I'm interested in. So I sort of feel the same way about anti-Zionism on campus at this point, which is one of inclusion but not pluralism. In other words, the argument would go, yes, there are Jews who are critical of Israel and anti-Zionist. Obviously, I think we have a hard task in where exactly to draw that line. Is criticism of the war, so there is some question of gray area of the line. But once we establish some line, if somebody's on the other side of that line saying, you're still welcome to all the events, the same way, my cheeseburger eating friend or, the Messianic Jew is welcome also, but I'm just not interested in helping you speak at Shabbat dinner or hosting a speaker or running a conversation, because that's just not what we're doing here. I'm curious what you think of this in terms of, general Zionism, anti-Zionism, because oftentimes I think this is the point that people get really caught up on, and I probably spend too much time in fighting anti-Semitism WhatsApp and Facebook groups. I think we all have the last
Yeah.
couple of years. And, you know, I don't, I think it's sort of the same, almost the same way that, liberalism has to account for like the craziest 1% of liberals. I think, anybody can find an example where some local Hillel has some student group where they're representing some far out opinion, because Hillel's general disposition. I actually remember, I'll give you a crazy story for a second. This was a really funny thing that happened. It was totally an accident. When I was at UCLA in undergrad, um, I'm sure Rabbi R.A. Kaplan and Aaron Lerner would remember this. I'll have to send them this podcast. There was a group of students who wanted to invite some rabbi who was visiting from Israel. And someone didn't do a background check. They were just like, oh, yeah. Here's the Beit Midrash. Here's the room. Here's dinner. I attended because I was, interested in random rabbi. The guy ended up being a full-blown Kahanist. So now we're talking about
Yeah.
the other side, and his ideas, I mean, not closet Kahanism, but
Oh
like,
boy.
outwardly, source sheets with Meir Kahana and not, pre-moving to Israel Kahana, JD, but like full
This is
blown,
now an inside conversation. Bring it back.
exactly, exactly. um, and I remember it was a very interesting, we basically had to tell, or Hillel had to tell the student, like, sorry, this is just
Yeah.
out of bounds. Like, you, student, still come to Shabbat dinner, but like, we're not doing this anymore. And I think we have to be, equally, if not, more strict on the other side, especially in a moment like this.
Yeah. Well, first of all, as someone who grew up eating In-N-Out burgers and occasionally missing them when I come back to the West Coast, I can relate to all of this. And as someone who, despite my eating In-N-Out burgers, was embraced and loved and told like you have a place here in the Jewish community, and within a halacha community or I'm so glad that I wasn't written off, right? And I'm so glad that we in modernity, especially in our spaces like Hillel, have found a way to um, take the wide variety of our practices or lack of practices, um, um, at whatever for whatever they are, and still find a way to accept and love and care for and take our Jews seriously. So, and I think that ethos actually does push me also, like you, on these issues. And I want to be careful, like I'm not speaking for every Hillel or every Hillel director or even the organization here. I'm a deeply committed Zionist. Zionism, my commitment and my connections to Israel have been amongst the most profound and important parts of my life, my adult life in particular. I do everything I can to be in Israel as much as possible, to get my children to Israel as much as possible, to read about Israel, to read about, and it's such a significant point in my life, and I say that um, uh, not as in a like not as in a but. Uh, but um, I want us to be able to again be as capacious here as possible. I feel strongly that we have to be cautious about platforming and giving the impression of endorsement around certain ideas, and that's on the left and on the right. Um, but I also think we have to be highly trusting of our students and their ability to hear hard things, their ability to learn about a complex history, a relationship to Zionism and anti-Zionism, especially before the state the modern state was created. I think it wasn't so simple that we were always gonna committed Zionists, and now I think something has shifted obviously since 48, and we have to take Zionism seriously, and I think it's an important and integral part of modern Jewish life. So for me, like we can't cast it aside and say, oh, that's not my Judaism. Like I think if we're going to take Jews seriously and ask Jews to take Judaism seriously, we have to put that on the table and say, like, you can't just say this isn't, you can't write off half of your people, you can't write off half of our theology, you can't write off half of our Torah. We're just not going to do that. So I think we have to engage students seriously in that conversation, which might sometimes mean like engaging seriously in conversations around what anti-Zionism means and doesn't mean, at least to us and to our, in our sources and such. Um, these things are incredibly fraught, and opening up our spaces to whether again anti-Zionists or Zionists who we're deeply uncomfortable with, as in the story that you told, have enormous institutional implications. And I think that we have a responsibility not just to our students and their student journeys, their journeys, but also to make sure that our institutions can be maintained, beyond the life on campus of any given student. And so, in the context of how this plays out in Hillel, um, it's exceptionally difficult and exceptionally complex to navigate. And because essentially many of our educators, directors, and such are holding this balance of like, I want to be so committed and student centric, and I don't want to, God forbid, push someone away from Jewish living and Jewish life. And I'm afraid that if I don't allow for their dissent and their disagreement with what's happening in Israel and their, position, even if I disagree with it on Israel, on Zionism, I'm afraid that I'm going to push them away, and God forbid they don't come back, right, to
Yeah,
Jewish
I
life.
think I think I
And
totally agree when it comes to
yeah,
the relationship part, right? So there's almost no ideological view. I mean, within reason, obviously if someone, wanted everyone dead, I'd probably have some thoughts, but
well, again, I
no,
go back to the behavioral, right?
yeah, yeah,
And that, right,
meaning,
if you behave in a way that causes fear or harm to other students, then you're out. And even though I love you and I want you to come back and find Jewish life, like, you're out if you can't behave, right? I think that's
but yeah, what I was more thinking is there's almost no view a student can come up to me with that I will not grab a cup of coffee with them and hear
fair.
them out and engage them with it. There's a much, much, much smaller range of views that I would, after Hamotzi at a Shabbat meal, say, Sarah's going to come up and share a couple words on something she's been thinking about, right? Like in regards to everything, right? I mean, Hillel's not even explicitly necessarily, I mean, we're not religious, but it's, Judaism is a much more civilization than religious. I wouldn't necessarily have a student who's an outspoken atheist get up and give a speech about their atheism at Shabbat dinner. I mean, maybe other Hillels would. I, of course, half my students are, agnostic or atheist. We have that conversation all the time within, bounds of, yeah, let's have pizza and let's talk about, God and lack of God and, atheism and all of that.
Right.
That's where I think the
And
conversation gets interesting. You know, I don't because I think Hillel, for funny reasons, when I was at this conference a couple weeks ago, people were saying that anti-Zionist students tend to criticize Hillel for not being sort of this, open place. And I think that the students' side, they're not really understanding the difference between you can talk about anything, grab a cup of coffee to who I'm going to give the microphone to. And I think that's a really important point to smooth over because we do it naturally for so many other things. I mean, there's a ton of issues. I'm not going to hand the microphone over. It's the same with politics. If a student feels particularly strongly about Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump, I would love to have that conversation with them. I talk about politics all the time, not giving them the microphone. And so it seems like a
yeah,
pretty obvious point when it comes to Zionism and anti-Zionism and what speakers will have and everything there. But I think because students obviously especially the students who are more critical of Israel, I do think, and maybe if you I'll give you ample time to respond to this. I do think with some of them there is something a little bit more nefarious where there are groups that are explicitly out there to try to discredit institutions
yeah,
like Hillel or, Birthright, that we saw a couple of years ago. And they kind of like understand our commitment to pluralism and use it against us in the sense of like, all right, well, we'll have this and this and this. And if Hillel says no, then we'll just say, Hillel's rejecting, blah, blah, blah. And I think we also can't fall into that trap of saying, we'll be inclusive. I would love to have you at Shabbat dinner, come join me, come hang out in my sukkah when everyone comes. But I'm not hosting your speaker, your grad
yeah.
student friend who's calling for an intifada. Like that's sort of an obvious red line.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I do think, I think we in these conversations around pluralism, we spend a lot of time talking about the boundaries of pluralism. And I think that's sometimes an excuse to avoid like the openings of pluralism. So I appreciate that we're trying to do both here. And I would say, yes, there are times where we have to say no. And I think we have to just take ourselves, we have to take the limits seriously, again, on the right and the left. And I've experienced your experience of sort of the nefariousness sometimes that you've experienced, that you've encountered with students, on the far left, or anti-Zionist groups that are not necessarily even Jewish students, but who will use use Hillel's commitments to Israel as a cudgel and say, like, and you're not really pluralist or whatever. However, they'll say it much more cruelly than that. Like, I've experienced that, and I've also certainly from the anti-Zionists, but we have to be honest. I've certainly experienced that from the right as well, and it's certainly experienced students who on the right who similarly are not committed to creating spaces that are open to a diversity of voices and opinions, and come after Hillel in very harsh ways, harsh terms, because it's not sufficiently, it hasn't lived up to their litmus test, whatever those are. And this is part of the point that I'm trying to get at in the article is that um, we don't do ourselves or our communities a service when we create litmus tests over and over again. We need to try and open up as much as possible. And I think so many of our litmus tests end up leading us to a type of anger. And this is really what I'm trying to get at, that I think is in the article, which is what I think we need to do is generally is resist the pull of polarization, which again I know is not like a would I or I wouldn't or wouldn't I answer to your important question, but I'm more interested, at least in the moment, of saying like let's resist the pull of polarization, not what not at the risk of retreating into silence or some sort of false neutrality. I mean, I have a lot of real strong convictions, right, about Israel, about all of these things. But I think we often mistake our deeply held positions with what's actually surfaced, what's actually under the surface, which is like a type of fomenting hatred that we have that when we've identified our enemy. And we're too quick to identify our enemy often. And I think we have to work very hard in our communities to not suppress conversation and conflict, actually, because the sword is in the Beit Midrash. We have to engage in the hard issues. We have to talk about the hard issues. And we have to do that wisely and in a way that won't destroy our communities. But we also have to suppress the hatred that comes along with those deeply held beliefs and the anger that we're holding that prevents us from doing the hard work of bridge building between people who are in deep disagreement, even on issues of Zionism and anti-Zionism, right? And I think even though that there are going to be people on the other side of the bridge, right, the ideological bridge who we deeply disagree with, like I think we have to find ways to walk toward each other on that bridge. And even if we don't find someone walking toward us, we have to remember that the work that we do is also meant to change us on our side of the bridge, right? It's meant to change who we are as human beings, as Jews, so that we're not living a life, a Jewish life, a life in this world that is sort of motivated by anger, by hatred of the other, by the litmus test that we're putting out there, but is motivated by a sense of integrity and conviction and humility and courage and again, moral seriousness and seriousness of Jewish living and practice, and takes our tradition seriously. So that's what I'm trying to encourage and support in our movement. And I think that if we can do that, yes, there are going to be hard cases always, and hard cases make bad law, as they say, right? Are you a lawyer also, Daniel? No.
I'm not.
But
No.
but you know the idea,
Yes.
and I think like let's not use those moments where the anti-Zionist comes up, or the speaker, like we have to make those choices, and for our institutions, and those are hard moments, but they're important that we draw lines. But let's not let those types of situations drive the nature of the work that we're trying to do, the mission that we're trying to achieve, the types of Jews we're trying to create as adult Jews.
Yeah. Well, Ben Berger, thank you so much.
I really appreciate this. This is this is great fun. I hope we'll do it again.